Good morning. It's a great honor to be able to share my ideas with you at such an inspiring event. I want to talk to you about emotions and risky technologies. Technology is great. Technology brings us TEDx. Technology brings us smartphones and the internet through which we can communicate with each other. Technology brings us airplanes and infrastructures that let us get around and see the world. Technology brings us shelter and machines that make our lives so much easier. Technology brings us nuclear energy. But is technology just great? Is nuclear energy just great? All technologies also have their potential downsides or risks. Risks are hard to predict. Risks are hard to handle. No technology without risks. Nuclear energy plants can explode. Airplanes can crash. Infrastructures can pollute our environment. Smartphones can track your whereabouts. Machines can break and cause accidents. No technology without risk. But can we create smarter technologies that are just great and have less risks? Well, let's first look at how we, at this moment, decide about risky technologies. And that's actually a pretty depressing story, because most debates about risky technologies end in conflicts between experts and lay people, or the public. The experts think that the technology is great. The public thinks that the technology is risky. They're worried about the technologies. The general idea is that the public is emotional about risky technologies, and that's why they reject them. The public doesn't understand complicated scientific information, like quantum physics, for example, like we heard this morning. The public rather relies on their irrational gut reactions and emotions, such as fear, anger, or disgust. And the idea is that because the public relies on these emotions, that's what makes them so irrational. So this is the common picture in debates about risky technologies. The public is emotional and irrational. The experts are scientific and rational. And this is the idea, this is the picture that occurs whenever there's a debate about risky technologies. But is this picture correct? Is the public just emotional? Or might the emotions not maybe point to important features that we should think about? The experts are said to be rational. They understand complicated scientific theories. They share scientific data with each other with objective scientific methods that are said to be very rational. But are the experts just rational? Might they not also be prone to biases? For example, to secure their next research funding in a highly competitive environment. They might be so enthusiastic about the technology that they overlook certain downsides of the technology. They might be caught up in a tunnel vision that lets them overlook the impact their technology might have on society. But more fundamentally, are emotions really just irrational? While that is, of course, the common view, that's the picture we always think about. Whenever something goes wrong in a debate or in public decision-making, the emotions are blamed. Whenever we want things to go right, we invoke reason and rationality. This opposition between emotions and rationality is so deeply ingrained in our culture and in our intellectual heritage that we hardly ever call it into question. But is this picture, the opposition between emotions and rationality, really correct? Well, not according to recent emotion research. Psychologists and philosophers, I'm a philosopher, who study emotions actually say that emotions are not contrary to rationality. Rather, they're a specific form of rationality. They're a practical source of rationality. Maybe we don't need emotions for number crunching. Maybe we do. But for sure, we need emotions to make moral and practical decisions. Emotions such as sympathy, compassion, feelings of responsibility and justice, and moral emotions such as shame, guilt, help us understand what morally matters to ourselves, but also to other people. The very famous neuropsychologist Antonio Damasio has studied people with specific brain defects who don't feel emotions anymore and who at the same time lost their capacity to make concrete moral judgments. These people still know in general that you should not lie, steal, kill, whatever, but when it comes to concrete decision-making in concrete circumstances, these people are completely clueless. More specifically, these people with these brain defects that let them lose their emotions also lose their capacity to make normal risk judgments. These people are not afraid of anything. They are willing to take outrageously huge risks that normal people would never want to take. So leaving risk judgments to people without emotions would be a huge mistake. Emotions are necessary to make moral judgments and to make risk judgments. Now you might ask, what does risk and technology have to do with morality and ethics? Everything. Technology is great, but technology can also be risky. Technology affects our well-being. It shapes the way we lead our lives. Technology has values incorporated into it. And we better make sure that it has the values incorporated that we want it to have. We don't want to leave it up to happenstance. So when designing technologies, we have to think about moral values that we want the technology to have. Now here comes my own idea that I developed in my research and that I'm so eager to share with you today. Emotions are necessary in order to grasp moral aspects of risky technologies. In current standard methodologies to judge about risky technologies, we use statistics and cost-benefit analysis. Now, cost-benefit analysis is basically a form of accounting. These are, of course, very important sources of information that are necessary to judge risky technologies. But they're not sufficient because they don't grasp all moral aspects of risky technologies. For example, cost-benefit analysis does not take into account whether technology is freely chosen. Cost-benefit analysis does not take into account whether the benefits and the risks of a technology are fairly distributed within a society. But autonomy and fairness are important moral values that should be taken into account in decision-making about risky technologies. Now, in my view, it's exactly the emotions that let us grasp these ethical aspects of risky technologies. For example, sympathy and compassion, justice and fairness, feelings of equity and equality and responsibility help us understand what morally matters about technology. Think about climate change. Climate change is basically due to the irresponsible behavior of people in affluent Western countries, people like us. The possible downsides, however, come down also on people in poor countries who have never contributed in their lives to climate change and who have less means to protect themselves against extreme weather conditions. Now, feelings of compassion and responsibility and guilt can make us understand that we have to change our behavior. Now, emotions also have another great aspect. Not only do they help us to see what we should do, they also provide us with motivation. Once we grasp what we should do through our emotions, we also have the energy, the capacity to go and realize these goals that we set ourselves through the emotions. Now you might say, oh, come on, this is such a naive story. Surely emotions can be terribly misleading. Yes, you're right. For example, our egoistic emotions are the ones that lead us to our polluting, irresponsible behavior. However, all our means of perception and judgment can mislead us. We have to correct our means of judging and perception. And in the case of emotions, the great thing is that emotions themselves also have critical, reflective potential. We can appeal to our emotions and train our emotions in order to critically assess our initial emotions. For example, in the case of nuclear energy, our fear of nuclear energy should be corrected by compassion for victims of coal mining and climate change. So, moral emotions point out how complex and difficult it is to make morally responsible decisions about risky technologies, and they help us to get all the various aspects out there that we have to think about. Now, current decision-making about risky technologies is a far cry from the picture I just sketched, and it falls in two potential pitfalls that are both based on the idea that emotions are irrational. The first pitfall is what I'd like to call the technocratic pitfall. According to the technocratic pitfall, we should ignore the emotions of the public because they are irrational. Rather, we should base our decisions on scientific, objective, rational, mathematical information provided by experts. So the public is basically excluded from decision-making on this model. The populist pitfall goes the opposite way, although it's also based on the idea that emotions are irrational. But here the idea is that we live in a democratic society, so we should respect the views of the public. However, the public is emotional/irrational, so we cannot engage in a meaningful debate with the public. So we just do whatever the public wants, even though it might mean that we do not implement technologies that might be very, very good for society. Now, instead, I propose a different model, what I would like to call an emotional deliberation approach to risky technologies. And this approach is based in the idea that I sketched before, that emotions are necessary to judge moral aspects of risk. So, debates about risky technologies should not ignore the emotions, as in the technocratic pitfall, nor should they take the emotions as the end point of discussion, as in the populist pitfall. Rather, emotions should be seen as the starting point of discussions about risky technologies, because there we can find out what the moral values are that people find important when thinking about risky technologies. When we ask people about what they are emotional about, we can see whether, for example, their emotions might indeed be irrational based on wrong information, and then it's the role of the scientists to provide the correct information in an emotionally accessible way, though, and that hardly ever happens. But it could also turn out that when you ask somebody, what are you emotional about, why are you afraid of this technology, that they come up with genuine moral concerns. For example, the well-being of future generations when it comes to nuclear storage or other considerations. And these are important moral values that should be taken into account in decision-making about risky technologies. So if you respect these risk emotions, you get better debates because you get all the moral values out that matter. You also shouldn't forget that, of course, the experts are human beings too, and they also have emotions. They're not just the people sitting behind their computers and machines. No, they have emotions too, and that's a good thing. Several debates about risky technologies have been triggered by experts who were worried about their own technology. Like, for example, in the case of genetically modified food in the 1970s, or recently in the case of nanotechnology, it turns out that experts are more worried about their own technology than the public. Now, this is a good thing, because the experts are the ones who are at the cradle of new developments, and they can influence the technology more than anybody else. So if they're worried about their own technology, they should develop it in a morally responsible way that takes into account their worries. So including emotions in risk decisions means better debates, but also better experts. At the same time, this leads to a better understanding between experts and lay people. Remember, the current situation is that most debates about risky technologies end up in these unsurmountable stalemates. Now, this approach that I'm offering might sound a little more complicated, but given our current not very hopeful situation, where we always end up in dialogues between the deaf, my approach might offer a real solution, because the public gets a genuine signal that they are taken seriously, which they're not taken in any of the other models that I described. Now, if people feel that they're taken seriously, they are willing to listen to each other. On the current models, the public is basically told that they're stupid, but then they're not willing to listen. If you tell them you have something important to say, they're going to be willing to listen to the experts who have the important scientific information. So, including emotions in debates about risky technologies means that we get morally better decisions about risk. Great technologies, but less unfair risks. Thank you.